Hello everyone, today we read and comment the 11th chapter of the 5th book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege, its title being Marches, continued. The text follows. Respecting the length of a march and the time it requires, it is natural for us to depend on the general results of experience. For our modern armies it has long been settled that a march of 3 miles should be the usual day's work, which on long distances may be set down as an average distance of 2 miles per day, allowing for the necessary rest days to make such repairs of all kinds as may be required. Such a march in a level country and on tolerable roads will occupy a division of 8,000 men from 8 to 10 hours, in a hilly country from 10 to 12 hours. If several divisions are united in one column, the march will occupy a couple of hours longer, without taking into account the intervals which must elapse between the departure of the first and the succeeding divisions. We see, therefore, that the day is pretty well occupied with such a march, that the fatigue endured by a soldier loaded with his pack for 10 or 12 hours is not to be judged of by that of an ordinary journey of 3 miles on foot, which a person on tolerable roads might easily get over in 5 hours. The longest marches to be found in exceptional instances are of 5 or at most 6 miles a day, for a continuance 4. A march of 5 miles requires a halt for several hours, and a division of 8,000 men will not do it, even on a good road, in less than 16 hours. If the march is of 6 miles, and that there are several divisions in the column, we may reckon upon at least 20 hours. We here mean the march of a number of whole divisions at once, from one camp to another, for that is the usual form of marches made on a theatre of war. When several divisions are to march in one column, the first division to move is assembled and marched off earlier than the rest, and therefore arrives at its camping ground so much the sooner. At the same time, this difference can still never amount to the whole time, which corresponds to the depth of a division on the line of march, and which is so well expressed in French as the time it requires for its découlement running down. The soldier is therefore saved very little fatigue in this way, and every march is very much lengthened in duration in proportion as the number of troops to be moved increases. To assemble and a march of the different brigades of a division in like manner at different times is seldom practicable, and for that reason we have taken the division itself as the unit. In long distances, when troops march from one cantonment into another and go over the road in small bodies, and without points of assembly, the distance they go over daily may certainly be increased, and in point of fact it is so, for the necessary detour in getting to quarters. But those marches in which troops have to assemble daily in divisions, or perhaps in corps, and have an additional move to getting into quarters, take up the most time, and are only advisable in rich countries, and where the masses of troops are not too large, as in such cases the greater facility of subsistence and the advantage of the shelter which the troops obtain compensates sufficiently for the fatigue for a longer march. The Prussian army undoubtedly pursued a wrong system in the retreat in 1806 in taking up quarters for the troops every night on account of subsistence. They could have procured subsistence in bivouacs, and the army would not have been obliged to spend 14 days in getting over 50 miles of ground, which after all they only accomplished by extreme efforts. If a bad road or hilly country has to be marched over, all these calculations as to time and distance undergo such modifications that it is difficult to estimate with any certainty, in any particular case, the time required for a march. Much less than can any general theory be established. All that theory can do is to direct attention to the liability to error with which we are here beset. To avoid it, the most careful calculation is necessary, and a large margin for unforeseen delays. The influence of weather and condition of the troops also come into consideration. Since the doing away with tents and the introduction of the system of subsisting troops by compulsory demands for provisions on the spot, the baggage of an army has been very sensibly diminished, and as a natural and most important consequence we look first for an acceleration in the movements of an army, and therefore, of course, an increase in the length of the day's march. This, however, is only realized under certain circumstances. Marches within the theater of war have been very little accelerated by this means, for it is well known that for many years, whenever the object required marches of unusual length, it has always been the practice to leave the baggage behind or send it on beforehand, and generally to keep it separate from the troops during the continuance of such movements, and it had in general no influence on the movement, because as soon as it was out of the way and ceased to be a direct impediment, no further trouble was taken about it, whatever damage it may suffer in that way. Marches, therefore, took place in the 7 Years' War, which even now cannot be surpassed. As an instance, we cite Lassie's march in 1760, and we had to support the diversion of the Russians on Berlin. On that occasion, he got over the road from Schweidnitz to Berlin through Lusatia, a distance of 45 miles in 10 days, averaging therefore 4.5 miles a day, which for a corps of 15,000 would be an extraordinary march even in these days. On the other hand, through the new method of supplying troops, the movements of armies have acquired a new retarding principle. If troops have partly to procure supplies for themselves, which often happens, then they require more time for the service of supply than would be necessary merely to receive rations from provision wagons. Besides this, on marches of considerable duration, troops cannot be encamped in such large numbers at any one point. The division must be separated from one another in order the more easily to manage for them. Lastly, it almost always happens that it is necessary to place part of the army, particularly the cavalry, in quarters. All these occasions on the wall a sensible delay. We find, therefore, that Bonaparte, in pursuit of the Prussians in 1806, with a view to cut off their retreat, and Blücher in 1850, in pursuit of the French, with a like object, only accomplished 30 miles in 10 days, a rate which Frederick the Great was able to attain in his marches from Saxony to Silesia and back, notwithstanding all the train he had to carry with him. At the same time, the ability of and handiness, if we may use such an expression, of the parts of an army, both great and small, on the theatre of war have very perceptibly gained by the diminution of baggage, partly inasmuch as while the number of cavalry and guns is the same, there are fewer horses, and therefore there is less forage required, partly inasmuch as we are no longer so much tied to any one position, because we have not to be for even looking after a long train of baggage dragging after us. Marches such as that which, after raising the siege of Olmütz, 1758, Frederick the Great made with 4,000 carriages, the escort of which employed half of his army broken up into battalions and companies, could not be effected now in presence of even the most timid adversary. On long marches, as from the Tagus to the Niemen, that lightening of the army is more sensibly felt, for although the usual measure of the day's march remains the same on account of the carriages still remaining, yet in cases of great urgency we can exceed that usual measure at a less sacrifice. Generally, the diminution of baggage tends more to a saving of power than to the acceleration of movement. So let's comment it. It's just an addition on marches, and specifically, how much time it takes to go through a certain length in Napoleonic times, compared a bit also to the previous ones of the 7 Years' War, where paradoxically armies traveled faster, right? Because they had less, they were less encumbered, right? They were smaller. Generally, they had less baggage, and also the ways of supplying were different on the basis of their size, really. So simply marches continued Respecting the length of a march and the time it requires, it is natural for us to depend on the general results of experience. For our modern armies, so in Napoleonic times, it has long been settled that a march of 3 miles, I don't know why today I mispronounce, I misread actually, and should be the usual day's work, right? Only 3 miles, yes, on long distances, which we're talking about the armies themselves. We're not talking specifically about the men, right? But the specific difficulty that all this mass of troops together to be coordinated requires, which naturally, as we'll see now, lengthens the time for which troopers have to stay in arms, because otherwise they would march presumably faster and with less dead time, that we will see also happens. Long distances may be set down as an average distance of 2 miles per day, allowing for the necessary rest days to make such repairs of all kinds as may be required. So this is not even naturally a matter of how long you can take it every day, but how beneficial is that, so that this distance can arrive up to 2 miles, especially for the longer columns, so that everybody can sleep, right, in a day of march. Because this thing with lengthens, otherwise at a point you give too few time for the individuals to rest. And such a march, von Clausewitz says, in a level country and on tolerable roads will occupy a division of 8,000 men from 8 to 10 hours. Right? In a hilly country, from 10 to 12 hours. Hilly, actually mountainous here could translate as well. So if several divisions, and as you understand, it all depends, it's all relative. If several divisions are united in one column, the march will occupy a couple of hours longer, which means naturally that, if you have divisions that march in parallel roads, as we've seen in previous chapters, they will get all more or less the same time. If you have a column, that simply lengthens also the space and time it takes, not just because of the physical of these parameters, but specifically also because of the effort of keeping the divisions, as we've seen, separated but yet in columns, so there is an extra organization to invest in. And so we'll occupy a couple of hours longer without taking into account the intervals which must elapse between the departure of the first and succeeding divisions as well, of course, as we were saying now, because of the space that always exists between a unit and another, unavoidable. And von Clausewitz says, we see therefore that the day is pretty well occupied with such a march, that the fatigue endured by a soldier loaded with his pack for 10 or 12 hours is not to be judged of by that of an ordinary journey of 3 miles on foot, which a person on tolerable roads will easily get over in 5 hours. Right? Think of marching. We will talk about, one day we'll make a video on the actual weights that were loaded. We're talking up to, think about World War I, we're talking almost more than 30 kilos sometimes. It's a big deal. And von Clausewitz says, the longest marches to be found in exceptional instances are of 5 or at most 6 miles a day, for a continuance 4. A march of 5 miles requires a halt for several hours, right? And a division of 8,000 men will not do it, even on a good road, in less than 16 hours. If the march is one of 6 miles and that there are several divisions in the column, we might reckon upon at least 20 hours. And you understand what it means. You have just 4 hours to sleep, which is something that basically if you carry out for multiple days in a row, like 3, you have permanent cerebral damage, right? This is actually, sleep is an important thing. Just imagine, to march in the face of the enemy. Hearing bombardments, explosion, we know things like, the French soldiers crossing the Black Forest in 1805 to run to Ulm actually slept while they were marching. They slept on the march. I mean, there are incredible stories we could tell about this because it's really amazing. But never underestimate the need in here, the rest. So the meaning, of course, of this example is to show how accelerating increasing simply the amount of length over which the army marches is not just, of course, adding arithmetically an extra effort that corresponds linearly to the other. No, it means to increase it exponentially at a point which you can't even have a functional army anymore, and it's much easier than you think. Actually, much more dangerous is sometimes you will have simply to do it because there is no other way maybe to get out of a dangerous situation. But that has a cost. Then von Clausewitz writes, we here mean the march of a number of whole divisions at once, from one camp to another, for that is the usual form of marches made on a theater of war. When several divisions are to march in one column, the first division to move is assembled and marched off earlier than the rest, and therefore arrives at its camping ground so much the sooner. At the same time, this difference can still never amount to the wall time, which corresponds to the depth of a division on the line of march, and which is so well expressed in French as the time it requires for its découlement, which means running down. The soldier is therefore saved very little fatigue in this way, and every march is very much lengthened in duration in proportion as the number of troops to be moved increases. To assemble and march off the different brigades of a division in like manner at different times is seldom practicable, and for often reason we have taken the division itself as the unit. So even distancing actually troops, units, is not much of a good idea. Also because consider just even the mess that happens all the time. Indeed, even arriving all together the quickest as possible, as far as the of course the physical strains are allow it, or they are useful compared to the effects you may have the day after, is better. Altogether, it's better to stay compact, do the thing quickly, fast, that good 2-3 miles, and that's pretty much it. Not much divisions of time and space during the march among the parts of the army, so that everything is fast, right, and compact and simple, and the army altogether can't rest. All right, so that they do not bother each other from the time. I don't know. We know, of course, that particularly long columns, of course, start the morning, and we know the rear guard leaves the camp when the others are beginning to place it. So it's a serious deal. It's really physically moving this bulky thing that has to make this effort in one shot, day by day, but then resting and doing it safely and orderly and without adding extra strains. Then von Clausewitz says, if in long distances, when troops march from one cantonment into another and go over the road in small bodies and without points of assembly, the distance they go over daily may certainly be increased, and in point of fact, it is so from the necessary detour in getting to quarters. So, as far as I understand here, he is referring to longer routes, let's say, on the case of which there are actually bivouacs, or better cantonments along the road, so that they're all prepared and you can technically make it faster to arrive there. And maybe, I don't say not caring about the unity of the wall formation, but also being a bit more flexible so that you know that there is still enough room there too. But it all of time and space prepared for you. But it's mostly something that can happen, as you understand, in a mostly friendly territory, or if not, however, in a situation has been controlled before, that where you can really find that support. Then von Clausewitz writes, but those marches on which troops have to assemble daily in divisions or perhaps in corps and have an additional move to get into quarters take up the most time, and they're only advisable in rich countries and where the masses of troops are not too large, and in such cases the greater facility of subsistence of the advantage of the shelter which the troops obtain compensates sufficiently for the fatigue of a longer march. Right? So as we were saying, actually in the example before, the point was exactly that if you have these camps, and you're already going to find shelter and supplies there, you can lengthen the march. This thing, the larger the army becomes, it's obviously shrinks in importance, and it's advisable to do it for army corps and so on, as we've seen here, in rich countries, and also with not excessive sizes, because at the end of the day, you still have to control this mass. It's becoming difficult, independently from the availability of it. That's something that just interacts with it. And Clausewitz says the Prussian army undoubtedly pursued a wrong system in their retreat in 1806, in taking up quarters for the troops every night on account of subsistence. So it means that basically dispersed them every night. So as a consequence, they could have procured subsistence in bivouacs at the same time. That was an option, and the army would have not been obliged to spend 14 days in getting over 50 miles of ground, right, which is pretty slow, which after all they only accomplished by extreme efforts, right? So actually dispersing the troops, simply saying, oh well, they live off the land, but that entails that you make this day of march is exhausting, and then you have to tell these guys, go wherever you like, and you have to battle with peasants to steal their food and enter their houses, and all the problems that derive from that. It was not quite clever. Von Clausewitz saying you may want that, as we'll see. Actually, it's the norm in Napoleonic times to live off the land. In this sense, there are interesting examples as well. I don't know if you've ever read the diaries of Napoleon, but there are pretty harsh realizations there, of course, of the violence, and examples were taken so on the civilian population. Then von Clausewitz says, if a bad road or a hilly ground has to be marched over, all these calculations as to time and distance undergo such modifications that it is difficult to estimate, right? Because really it's as if everything collapsed, right, in terms of these average data. As we've seen, it's rarer to, especially the larger and therefore the more important armies are, to lead them on a difficult ground. But even in there, it really depends on the terrain, and we do not know with any certainty. Von Clausewitz says, in any particular case, the time required for a march, much less than can any general theory be established. This also tells you in general, from a methodological point of view, how difficult it is to actually make a simple projection on something so banal like a march, right, on the base of terrain. Think of war altogether, right? It's impossible, of course. And then von Clausewitz says, all that theory can do is to direct attention to the liability of error, with which we are here beset. To avoid it, most careful calculation is necessary, and a large margin for unforeseen delays. That is, just wait for the worst. And the influence of weather and condition of the troops also come into consideration, of course, as always. Also for easier terrain, naturally, but here the effect is multiplied. This is what he's telling us. Then von Clausewitz says, since the doing away with tents and the introduction of the system of subsisting troops by compulsory demands for provisions on the spot, the baggage of an army has been very sensibly diminished. So as we have seen it, I don't remember whether in the previous chapter or the one before, these armies have become so large in Napoleonic times that actually they can paradoxically do without a lot of wagons. As far as these troops basically live off the land, and this makes the reason is connected to the whole structure of the army and how fluid and autonomously it works, basically. So that is an important part of the story, and this has brought, as we were saying before, to troops mostly living on their own on the field, whatever they find, a barn, house, and eating from stuff of the locals, essentially. So here, the baggage of an army, von Clausewitz says, has been very sensibly diminished, and as a natural and most important consequence, we look first for an acceleration in the movements of an army, in general, compared to certain aspects of previous times, at least, and in relative terms, and therefore, of course, an increase in the length of the day's march. This, however, is only realized under certain circumstances, because the situation altogether is not simpler. And he says, marches within the theater of war have been very little accelerated by these means. Which doesn't mean that there weren't benefits in relative terms, but just as far as the length, the speed for the day of march, well, this actually hasn't changed a big deal. It says, for it is well known that for many years, whenever the object required marches of unusual length, it has always been the practice to leave the baggage behind or send it on beforehand, and generally to keep it separate from the troops during the continuance of such movements. And it had in general no influence on the movement, because as soon as it was out of the way and ceased to be a direct impediment, no further trouble was taken about it, whatever damage it may suffer in that way. Marches therefore took place in the 7 Years' War, which even now cannot be surpassed. As an instance, we cite Lassie's army in 1760, when he had to support the diversion of the Russians on Berlin. On that occasion, he got over the road from Schweidnitz to Berlin through Lusatia, a distance of 45 miles in 10 days, averaging therefore 4.5 miles a day, which for a corps of 15,000 would be an extraordinary march even in these days. There is really no easy direct proportionality between the improvements in certain aspects of warfare, the energy they invest in it and so on, and the actual speed of the arm. Right, you can have times in history which armies simply marched faster. This is a good example, right? It seems to you that 3 miles in a day is very slow, right? Yes, but here there is a hell of a power that between the 18th and the 19th century the world had never seen before, so you can easily see how a medieval army was much speedier than this, but this is nothing. They were smaller and also less powerful, way less powerful in many ways. So naturally, this should always be taken into consideration in the picture. And then von Clausewitz says, on the other hand, through the new method of supplying troops, the movements of armies have acquired a new retarding principle. This is exactly the point. If troops have partly to procure supplies for themselves, which often happens, then they require more time for the service of supply than would be necessary merely to receive rations from provision wagons. Besides this, on marches of considerable duration, troops cannot be encamped in such large numbers at any one point. It's also another important thing must take into consideration. There's a limit of troops you can keep all together in the same place, and for a certain amount of time, by the way. You may not have all that space, or at least, you play on these other variables. It's mostly an hygienic problem, telling you the truth. And these are also, differences that do not change a big deal, historically speaking. Von Clausewitz says the divisions must be separated from one another in order the more easily to manage for them. In all means, also in terms of just of deployability, but specifically in this case for where the hell do you place them and how do you keep them organized and nourished and so on. And lastly, it almost always happens that it is necessary to place part of the army, particularly the cavalry, in quarters. That's a bit more delicate. And all these occasions on the wall a sensible delay, as you understand. And we find therefore that Bonaparte, in pursuit of the Prussians in 1806, with a view to cut off the retreat, and Blücher in 1815, in pursuit of the French, with a like object, only accomplished 30 miles in 10 days. That is, as we have seen, the average. A rate which Frederick the Great, however, so back in the 7 Years' War, was able to attain in his marches from Saxony to Silesia and back. Now, that was the usual game there. Every time war broke out, Prussia invaded Saxony and then it went to Silesia. Saxony to Silesia and back, notwithstanding all the train that he had to carry with him. So it was much speedier at the time, spite of all. And at the same, but because exactly armies were kind of less demanding on their own, and they were more armed. Let's say that they were all about this thing projected in the space. Now, it's as if the armies filled the strategical map as big as they are. Then von Clausewitz says, at the same time, the mobility and handiness, if we may use such an expression, of the parts of an army, both great and small, on the theatre of war have very perceptibly gained by the diminution of baggage, partly inasmuch as, while the number of cavalry and guns is the same, there are fewer horses, and therefore there is less because there are no wagons, because the troops forage locally, so they don't have to spend, they don't have to have forage for the same horses that will bring the wagon. There can be more cavalry. It's a great gain in that sense, in terms of baggage. And there is less forage required, in fact, partly inasmuch as we are no longer so much tied to any one position, because we have not to be forever looking after a long train of baggage dragging after us. Marches such as that, which after raising the siege of Olmütz 1758, Frederick the Great made with 4,000 carriages, the escort of which employed half of his army broken up into single battalions and companies, could not be effected now in presence of even the most timid adversary. Because it would be too cumbersome. On long marches as from the Tagus to the Niemen, so out across all of Europe, that lightening of the army is more sensibly felt, right? Because that becomes really structurally, like it's not just a march from one town to another. It's literally you start feeling the cost of the whole army going from Spain to Russia with a dimension that it's really going to be on the payrolls of a state. Like that costs really a lot, logistically speaking. So the difference is more sensibly felt, although the usual measure of the day's march remains the same. And this is also interesting, which shows you pretty well how, you can go the same speed, but still it could be much more, much easier in proportion to the number of troops like it was in the past. So on the same account of carriages still remaining, yet in cases of great urgency, because that can still happen, we can exceed the usual measure at a less sacrifice. Generally, the diminution of baggage tends more to a saving of power than to the acceleration of movement, right? And this is quite important to understand, because it's not just a tactical thing. I mean, that's something that happens behind the scenes, right? As we were saying before, less horses for the wagons, fine. You can have more horses for lots of other stuff. It's not necessarily military, but horses like in civilian use that can produce more cannonballs, given the industry that revolves around that, and such. And this is very indicative of what we just said. It's not about the movement, really. Or better, it is in part, right? It's as if the advantage was distributed in the connection of the army, but for what the army can do, literally, in a tactical and strategical way, rather than just having simply more availability of resources. Many ways, or at least, also in ways as we've seen, just foraging and billeting troops among the local population and so on, depending on their circumstances, but substantially still making the military side of it work, not the logistics of it. It's important to distinguish the two things, because logistically speaking, there would be so many important things to say. Logistics is really crucial at so many levels, but the point here that we should never be underestimated, it's not that, just because you have a great logistics that works, it's fine, it's masterpiece, well, you'll have to win the war, right? War is won militarily, not logistically, and that's also what we should say. But the two things are intertwined. Yes, they're always intertwined, like with everything else, but conceptually speaking, the theory of the art of war does not include things like logistics, right? So how use, as we've seen it in the Vom Kriege, the armed forces as they are ready, so also fully supplied, right? Which doesn't mean you don't have to take the thing into consideration that generals do not do. They should. In fact, some of the greatest generals were also great logists at many levels, but at the same time, they are two distinguished things, right? Never think it's everything about logistics or the physicality of space. No, it's really about the intensity of the strength that is performed at that point, is enacted at that point. All right, it was a fairly short chapter. We have another one ahead, similar in length. But for today, we stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.